Hello everybody, and welcome to Some Patches Required, a show where we hope to educate and entertain you on the ever-turbulent games industry. As always, I am one of your hosts, Aaron.
And I'm your other host, Zach.
And this week we return to you with games. We're back from vaguely game-related tech news, which was kind of our last outing of this. I guess it's a new season. Are we calling this a new season?
This is technically a new season. Yeah,
technically a new season, but our season schedule is less consistent than anything Netflix has shat out in the last however long it's been doing its grim work. But before
our prices
we
remain
dig
consistent.
Sorry. Yes. No. So before we actually dig into the topic at hand today, of course, it's time to thank all of you people, you fine, wonderful individuals who have stuck with us and listened to multiple episodes across our disturbingly long tenure on podcasting, which is, of course, a beautiful paradise island. If you've stuck with us, again, just huge thank you. And if it's your first time listening, welcome. It's wonderful to have you. If you all collectively would not mind too terribly hitting that good old engagement button on your platform of choice, liking the episode, subscribing where relevant, sharing with a friend or a mortal enemy, that is, of course, much, much appreciated. It is the best and, in fact, only way for us to grow as a show, and we appreciate anything you can do to help us in that endeavor. Outside of the clerical work, though, we're here to talk about Marvel Rivals, a video game that is really actually like at the height of its popularity right now, which may have come as a surprise to some people pre-launch, but this far into its life cycle is not hugely surprising if you've been following the news.
I half expected you to say, Marvel Rivals, a game that's made by Communist China. Which actually it is. NetEase
is, yeah.
Which is a Chinese super corporation, functionally, at least in the game space, is behind Marvel Rivals. And to further elaborate on Aaron's point, Marvel Rivals in January, I believe, with the release of their season 1, peaked at 644,000 concurrent players. So that's players at a single time. So obviously there's more than just 600,000 people playing the game, but that's actually absolutely ridiculous. That's, I think, 200,000, almost 200,000 higher than Helldivers ever had. And obviously that game was hugely successful on Steam.
Yeah. Giant mega success for both, Sony. It made Arrowhead a household name among game players. And it's also, I think you had a note in here saying it's like outpacing GTA 5 on Steam consistently, which is such a weird benchmark, but that game has been such a mainstay in the top 10 list on Steam for so long that it's always kind of a useful little measuring point. The game, which is for those of you uninitiated, essentially an Overwatch. To say clone might be a little bit doing it a little bit of a disservice, but it's essentially an Overwatch clone that is populated by characters from the Marvel comics. It is a hero shooter. What is it? What are the team sizes on the game? I don't remember.
I'm pretty sure it's 6v6. I could Google this, but I'm lazy.
Yeah, so we'll say 6v6 hero shooter game with very similar modes and maps to something like Overwatch, and it is absolutely tearing up the charts, and more interestingly, eating Overwatch's lunch in some pretty profound ways, especially Overwatch 2, which we don't need to get into the entire troubled saga of Overwatch 2 in order to explain why this game is so interesting. But yeah, that game had a famously difficult production, and it released kind of half finished, and a lot of people don't consider it to have been a worthy successor to the original Overwatch. It both in terms of like tone, quality, or really like the general feel of the game. And this seems to have taken up that mantle and captured the imagination and, more importantly, interest of players in a fairly profound way. But what we're actually going to be digging into outside of its tremendous popularity during this episode is the cadence at which new content is being released for Marvel Rivals, which in comparison to especially Overwatch 2, but in fairness, a good handful of other live service games, is a very aggressive cadence for new content, especially new characters. And we thought it might be interesting to kind of dig into some of the differences there, what the game is doing that is a little bit unique, and whether or not that sort of thing is, sustainable in the long term. Because as we've seen, a lot of live service games just don't last.
Well, I think on that note, just kind of the last thing that sticks out about the game is that it came out, I believe, on December 6th of 2024. So it is a 2024 game, technically. And 2024 saw a lot of live service games, as you know, Aaron, but quite a few of them are not really doing great. Whether that's like just Kill the Justice League, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, sorry. I mean, obviously we saw a lot of the issues with that game before it even came out, but there's that game that didn't do particularly well, doesn't do particularly well when it comes to concurrent users. There's the game The Finals that I think does okay, but like is not doing amazing. There's all these other games. Even Helldivers had some periods of turmoil where it lost a lot of its player base after largely being considered a pretty big success. And, all these games have different reasons for why they went through trouble, but we're really in a period where a lot of games as a service are failing. And then, of course, Concord. We talked about Concord. There's a lot of reasons why Concord failed, but, it still illustrates that games as a service is not a healthy area to be. And it's very possible there's a world where Marvel Rivals just flops. It's obviously not this one, but at least not yet. But that's another big standout.
I think just to kind of elaborate on that point, there's not only a world in which Marvel Rivals flops, but it's hard to say that name fast, isn't it? In which Marvel Rivals fails. It's actually, in my opinion, if we're gonna go multiverse with this shit, it's actually more likely that Marvel Rivals flops. Both because, obviously we're seeing fatigue in the sort of superhero film space. Not that those movies aren't still, making money to some degree, but their heyday is definitely, behind us, I would say. But more importantly, superhero-focused video games have not necessarily done great. Like, all of the DC attempts at making live service superhero games have kind of fizzled out pretty dramatically. Gotham Knights did not do well at all. Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League was, like you said, it was a pretty high profile failure for Warner Brothers and Rocksteady. I think it saw its biggest player bump during the time that I bought it, when I could get it for like $3. Which is kind of wild that it happened during its launch year. That's not normally a discount you see for a game that's less than 12 months old. And yeah, so like these games that should theoretically, just based on their IP, be successes, often fail to find that audience, partially because, again, the market and the specific space in which these games are trying to play is so saturated with these established franchises that already eat up so much of people's time and so much of people's energy and so much of people's attention that trying to carve out even a small niche out of the remaining market share is a legitimate challenge. And Marvel Rivals has, at least up to this point, completely overcome those odds to be a hugely, hugely successful game. We're living in a fracture off point in this universe. It's not the outcome I think a lot of people were predicting for the game necessarily. I don't think people expected it to be quite as successful as it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely interesting because it wears its inspiration on its sleeves quite aggressively. And if you were to tell me that an Overwatch like predecessor with some tweaks but largely kind of the same vibe, and also it's not as polished as Overwatch was gonna do as well, that's not something that I would have had necessarily on my bingo card per se. I think the biggest thing that you brought up before we get into the content, just because I think this is funny, is like I have absolutely zero interest in really seeing any of what Marvel is putting, Marvel Studios as in the film TV side of things at Disney.
Yeah.
I have very little interest in what they're doing. Anything Marvel related that Sony's put out has been ass lately.
I'm actually more interested in those, in fairness. I wish they would keep making them forever because they're
so bad.
They're delightfully bad.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I heard Craven was just unwatchable, but like boring bad. Madam Web.
That's what I heard about Madam Web too. Is 2 hours of nothing happening.
Yeah. Well, it's like Venom from my understanding, and I've seen one of the Venom movies, is the only one that's like kind of fun bad. But regardless of any of that, I just, I don't care about heroes like I used to. I remember in college I was super into it. So, it's interesting that this can get around that kind of overtapped IP issue, so to speak.
Yeah. I think in some ways it actually succeeds in that way because the other good example of a live service game that flopped in this thing is Marvel's Avengers, the Square Enix or Crystal Dynamics Marvel's Avengers game, which
I forgot was even a thing. Dear Lord.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're not the only one. That game was a huge flop back when it came out. It might have sold well right at the beginning, but it was not played by many people and it wasn't supported for very long. And I played it. It was not good. So that was a whole thing. But that was like very clearly film vibes inspired. I think this game can kind of stand on its own legs, partially because it is so comic booky and there isn't really a narrative to it, right? There's no strong world building. There's no strong relation, like there may be movie skins put in, but there's no direct relationship there. So you kind of get the platonic ideal, right? You get the idea of Spider-Man. Like, I want to play as Spider-Man. I want to play as Mr. Fantastic. You can just take the idea of fighting as these characters in an Overwatch style game, and it gives people who aren't necessarily into the comics an excuse to play as the characters they know. It gives people who are deeply into the comics an excuse to dig way in and play as the characters they love. And none of it feels inherently tied to the MCU, which I think at this point can only be a benefit to its sort of accessibility to the larger market.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not tied to anything that Disney's doing outside of the fact that these are the same characters and they are, echoes of the stories that have happened in the comics and maybe some of the things that have happened in the movies, because they're all kind of echoes of what's happened in the comics. So definitely heavily inspired, but no direct tie-in, except for the skins, like you said. There are some direct from the movie skins. But
it would be a waste not to have those in there. That's just a money-making opportunity for comparatively minimal effort.
Yeah, honestly, the wildest thing with the skins too is there's some fucking like there's some horned up content in this game, and if you look at the equivalent ESRB rating. It doesn't have an ESRB rating. It's got another international kind of standard. I think it's 12 plus is what the standard says. There are some skins in this game, and I'm like, my God, like, I don't know. There's specifically the Invisible Woman, like weird dominatrix, my dogs are out skin. For those that don't know, when I say my dogs are out, I mean the feet. Her feet are out. Like there's a lot going on with that skin. It's horned up, Aaron. It's making people feel things on the internet.
But people have never gotten horny for comic book characters, Zach. You know this.
Or women in games. You're right. And yet, we also live in the time where they're taking away the sexy women from our games. Yeah, what does it say about us when, like, communist China, our great enemy, is, making sexy women in games, and we're, like, complaining about there not being sexy women in games? Like, is China coming in to save us from the ugly women in video games issue? Like, are they the bastion of sanity in this world of ugly women?
We all love TikTok.
God, that's a whole thing.
And that's I mean, sure.
he has no argument against what I've said. Anywho, content cadence. Woo!
Content cadence. More horny skins faster.
Yeah. Well, funnily enough, I don't even think we're not really touching on the skin component of it today.
No, I just
but they do release
a little narrative
amount.
through line.
Yeah, they do release a decent amount of skins. Marvel Rivals has stated that they will have a pretty aggressive content cadence. The quick kind of TLDR on this is that they have stated they are going to have a new season every 3 months. So that's about 4 seasons a year. That's a pretty normal speed, I think, for seasons. With seasons, they will be releasing 2 new characters every season. They will be releasing a new map with each season, a new battle pass. That's also pretty standard. And then they have mentioned that occasionally they will have new game modes as well. Oh, and new hero team up abilities, which is basically a special ability that happens when you pick 2 characters that have some kind of like thematic bond in like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or Marvel Universe, not cinematic. So yeah, that would be a total of 8 new characters a year, 4 new maps a year, 4 battle passes, and then some game modes, kind of sprinkled in there. And then with the hero team ups, I think they add more than just one, potentially. They didn't really give like a concrete number for that. So that's a lot of content coming your way every 3 months. The only other thing I should mention is that they have also mentioned that the way that they're going to break down their season passes their seasons is that one character will come out at the beginning of a season and the other character will come out more towards the middle. So you're going to get a new character every 6 weeks. And that's more of what we're going to be focusing on today, because that is a pretty ridiculous launch cadence for characters.
Yeah. Yes. It surely is. So I think the way that we have this structured is to first talk about whether or not they can keep up that cadence for the foreseeable future. And I think that's the question is fairly easy to answer, right? Because yes, they can, for a variety of different reasons. The main one that jumps out to me just in terms of the challenge, I suppose, of releasing new characters for a game like Overwatch, especially Overwatch 1, was that all of the characters were very well defined, original characters with original designs that needed to be written into the lore of the game. Marvel has 100,000 years of comic book history to pull characters from and inspiration from for different variants on designs. I do not think that they will have a shortage of IP to pull from in order to. It's the most surface level part of it, but I really don't think that there's no shortage of mainstream and obscure characters to continue adding to the roster of what it launched with. 33 heroes?
Yeah, 33 at launch.
Yeah, which is already enough to make it overwhelming for me, as somebody who doesn't normally play games like this. But yeah, like 33 characters is a drop in the pan for the Marvel lexicon. They could keep up a 6 characters a year cadence for the rest of linear time and not run out of characters to pull from the source material. So I think if that's the baseline surface level argument, yes, obviously, that sort of thing can be sustained. I think you also found that someone found through data mining that there's already 16 additional characters in some stage of development or testing.
Yeah, so they data mined a total of at least 16 more characters that are in some stage of development. And that does not include the 4 Fantastic Four members that are being added in season 1 that's going on right now. So they've already released 2 of the Fantastic Four, Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Woman. And then the other 2, which are the Thing, and I always forget the Fire Boy's name.
Human Torch?
Human Torch, thank you. Yeah,
I always think of like Johnny Blaze, I think that's Ghost Rider.
Oh, I like that name more, if I'm being honest. But regardless, they're all coming out this season. So by the end of February, we will have 37 characters in Marvel Rivals, and the game would have only been out for like 3 months. For some interesting data points that I didn't really necessarily know off the top of my head, Aaron, Overwatch, actually, you already read this, so I can't do this to you. Overwatch only has 42 characters right now, and that game has been out for quite some time. So we are almost at more characters than Overwatch in the modern day, which is wild.
Yeah, but to my original point, well, not to my original point, but to one of the points I made in there, I think Overwatch is kind of a victim of its own ambition, at least insofar as the original idea for how they would do characters seemed to be laid out. In that, again, those are original characters who need to work within the lore of what was at one point a fairly well-defined world. And I remember when the original animated shorts were coming out, establishing the original characters from Overwatch 1, and people were just falling in love with these characters, right? So if they were going to maintain that quality bar through season after season after season after season, they would have either had to get started way early in order to maintain a cadence nearly as fast as this, or they would need to drop the quality bar. Like there's just no way to come up with characters that are going to resonate with people from whole cloth, have compelling original designs, and fit mechanically into the game at a speed like that. Again, I know the game itself has become a little bit sloppier, but they still have the burden of generating original, characters that I'm sure somewhere still at Blizzard. I almost said BioWare. Somewhere still at Blizzard, there's a lot of care that goes into kind of fostering the character side of things. So I think Overwatch is maybe, even though it's the most direct point of comparison to Rivals, I think it is still something of an outlier in that space.
Wait, are you saying that Overwatch is an outlier or that Marvel's is an outlier?
I think Overwatch is something of an outlier in that space. Not to say that the other games don't have to come up with original characters, but I feel like the narrative weight that was originally put on there, if they were trying to maintain that does make Overwatch something of a little bit of an outlier.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely, I would say from my perspective that it's Marvel Rivals that is a bit of the odd the ugly duckling, the odd one out. Because if you look at a lot of these games, I mean, they're purely unique. Like for just as an example, right? Apex Legends releases not in the same genre of game, but is an agent-based battle royale kind of experience. And the biggest difference between it and Marvel Rivals and Overwatch is that in Apex Legends, you've got like one or two abilities that your character has, and then you've got what the character looks like. And then there's an attitude that they're selling and all of that jazz. But that game just only released with 8 characters in 2019, and it only has 26 characters right now. So like even Apex Legends, Rainbow Six Siege, which was another big operator-based game. Again, most of the characters only really had one unique ability. Outside of that, it was like, what guns and equipment do you give them? There's not like powers. There's personality and design and all of that, but they only released with 20 operators. So I mean, we're going in with Marvel Rivals with a considerable amount of content. I think the only games that would have been comparable at launch would have been Dota 2, which I didn't note how many heroes they had at launch, because I grabbed League of Legends since that's the bigger of the two. And League of Legends released with 40 characters in 2009, which is buck wild. And now that game has over 100 characters. But, kind of...
Dota 2 launched with 24 heroes.
So, yeah, I mean, it beat Dota, which, they have more now, but Dota's been slower to release characters than League has been. But regardless, like, it's just... I say all of those more as like a reference point for how ridiculous it is that Marvel Rivals has launched with so many characters. I would say that their point of, I want to release 8 new characters a year, is kind of proven possible by some of these competitors. I mean, there were years where League of Legends was releasing 24 characters every year. And specifically, that's 2010 and 2011. So that's way more than what Marvel is even trying to do. Now, League didn't have to make a new map, and they weren't, doing some of that jazz, but that's still a ridiculous amount. And then my last thing I'll just say is that Rainbow Six, for the first few years, was releasing 8 characters a year. And they were able to do that. So, I mean, people have done it before. We've got 16 in development. So they're probably good for at least the next 2 years.
Yeah, which I think, not that you can't have a precipitous drop-off after that point, but like keeping the cadence up for 2 to 3 years seems like, strategically speaking, it seems like that has to be their intention, right? Because by that point, the game will have found a very established audience. The player count will have evened out to the point where they'll be able to realistically look at like, okay, the newness of it has worn off. We're going to be able to see how our long-term strategy is playing out. And, maybe they'll be able to draw new people in with these new characters, but at the very least it may keep their player base itself satisfied. But by the time you get to 2, 3, 4 years, it's no longer the new kid on the block, the upstart coming for the throne. It's one of the major players, at which point it gets to kind of dictate its own rules a little bit more measuredly, which is not a word, but I've decided for the purposes of this sentence that it is.
Well, I think the other thing too that's kind of interesting is when you look at a lot of these games, they have a really solid cadence for about 3 to 4 years, and then almost across the board in year 5, you see a big drop off when it comes to the number of new characters coming out per year. The size of that drop off can vary. Like League right now, I think only has like 4 characters come out a year, 3 or 4, compared to the 24 it used to. Like, that's wild. Obviously that game's been out for a long time. I do think the other kind of interesting thing about Marvel Rivals is, like, to your point, they have a massive catalog to pull from, but how many of those characters do people really give a shit about, right? Like, eventually, so let's say 4 years down the line, right? So if in 2 years they can release 16 characters, 32 characters from now, 4 years from now, like, are they going to be pulling out like Professor Bubble Boy? And I'm like, I don't give a shit about this character. Like, you know, they do run the risk of needing to make sure they're releasing relevant characters with potentially less relevant characters, so they keep up that excitement, but they have characters to use. Like, they don't want to burn through all the characters that everybody gives a shit about and just go to all the obscure ones. So it's going to be an interesting balance from that perspective as well.
Right. I think there are definitely opportunities in there, but like, I don't know, man. Jeff the Land Shark is arguably, I think, one of the more popular characters in the game. And I do not think I had ever heard of Jeff the Land Shark before I started reading headlines about Jeff the Land Shark in Marvel Rivals. So I definitely agree with you. I think as a selling point, they do need to keep some of their more popular characters in their pocket. But I also think that there is a strong opportunity to differentiate through gameplay where that becomes possible. And I think we'll dip into that as potentially a bit of an issue later on. But yeah, I mean, I've just Googled obscure Marvel characters. So we could see updates that include Frogman, 3D Man, Angar the Screamer.
That just sounds like a gamer.
It does.
That's just the other people on your team.
The ironically named Backlash. For the people who hate woke content in games, they'll probably stay away from Bi Beast.
Bi Beast, like bisexual.
Bi Beast.
Interesting.
Yes, exactly. We couldn't have that in our game.
Wild.
Yeah. So I'm like, yeah, Man Thing. You know, there. But like, again, if they can find a hook to make any of these characters compelling to play, then I think they can definitely make Angar the Screamer into like a runaway sort of Beta Ray Bill.
I feel like
everyone's
I
favorite
definitely
character.
I knew that name for some reason.
I definitely don't. I there's a handful of these that I do. Doorman.
Well, so here's the thing. I mean, you're definitely right that if they do it like in an intellectual way, they're going to be fine. But if they just have like an entire year of obscure heroes that no one really cares about, I do think that eventually weighs on like players, because people love the Fantastic Four. I don't get it. I'm gonna be completely honest. I think they're kind of nerds, which is fine, but I don't know, I think they're just kind of losers, but like I'm not into it, but they're beloved. So like you know, we saw this massive uptick when they came out. Like, is the Jeff the Screamer, I know that's not his name, but is the Screamer and Frogman update gonna be as big? Like, probably not. You know, some people are gonna check it out because they just really like the game, but I'm sure a lot of people that joined season 1, it was like, oh, you know, I really like the Fantastic Four. I should check this thing out. So
yeah, the positioning of the Fantastic Four as the added characters for season 1 was absolutely strategic.
Yeah,
100%. It wasn't like those were the 4 most polished ones that they picked off the top of the pile. They knew that people would come to play as Fantastic Four.
Yeah.
Right? It's the same reason that Iron Man was a launch character.
Yeah, and Spider-Man and Thor.
And Spider-Man and you know, and then they threw a bunch of obscure ones in there as well. And again, by everything that I've read and some of the stuff that I've experienced from playing the game, characters like Squirrel Girl and Jeff the Land Shark, who are definitely on the more obscure side of things, were definitely given like some gameplay verve, so that people would start buzzing about these obscure characters. And, you know, that increases the, you know, the engagement with, you know, the entire thing across the viral marketing, you know, all that sort of thing. what do you mean people are playing as Squirrel Girl and what is a Jeff the Land Shark? And suddenly that's a whole thing. So yeah, I mean, like, if they can keep a decent mix of them, then I definitely think that they have almost unlimited potential. And they can also introduce like dark universe, mirror universe. I think that's a Star Trek thing, but like, they've got a billion different directions to go with the characters. So I think in terms of just pure material, like you said, as long as they keep a decent ratio, even if it's just like one known character to 3 or 4, maybe 5 obscure characters, I think they'll probably be fine in terms of keeping people's interest.
Well, kind of. So honestly, I think this is really what we're discussing is one of the potential issues that could happen because of an aggressive content cadence is basically if you're not careful with it and you've got established IPs, you burn through all the characters people talk about too fast. Like that's ultimately kind of the air quotes issue that we're talking about. I think something related to what we're talking about right now is bland character design decisions. I don't know what your opinion on this is, Aaron, but I think that when you're Marvel or DC and you've got 5 million different characters that you're making, some of the characters end up being the same goddamn thing as each other.
Oh, yeah.
Like, you've got superheroes that punch good. And like that's their whole thing. And it's like, how do you make this character stand out versus that character? And I feel like a lot of the time, and I'm not a comic book person, I am not a comic book artist. I feel like sometimes it's just what the character looks like. What is their backstory? Are people into that? Right. And so that's probably why you've got some characters that are kind of redesigns of each other as you're really trying to like hit the spot where like it resonates with people. But where that's an issue for this game is if like there's multiple characters and their superpower is they punch good and they have like regenerative abilities and whatever, like how do you differentiate those characters in a meaningful way? Like
exactly,
they're going to feel bland if you make them literally unique. So I kind of wonder if eventually with some characters, they'll end up making skins to basically say like, yes, this is, I can't think of any great examples right now. There's like all the different Iron Mans. Like there's the Tony Stark Iron Man, and then there is, I forgot who the girl Iron Man is, but basically, and they both look different and they have kind of different powers, but like, does it make sense to make both of them, or should you just make an Iron Man skin that is this other character? I wonder if they're going to end up going down that route, eventually, because that technically is them introducing new characters, kind of milking the hype of adding some new people, but it's not like over, it's not diluting what they have currently.
Yeah. I personally would actually, I think, and maybe this is just my bias showing, but I think that would actually suit me as a player better. Because again, like what you're talking about, from a narrative perspective, a lot of these characters who are very samey are defined by their context, their environment, and the stories that they are placed in, right? The superhero who punches good is every action movie. You know what I mean? So it is the circumstances in which you place that character and the way that that character uniquely responds to the events that unfold around them that make for a compelling story. But removed from that context, they are distilled down to what they can do and how that specifically is different from what any of the other characters can do. And I will say personally, as somebody who does not really play hero shooters, but did play a handful of matches in Marvel Rivals in preparation for this episode, my dude, I actually do not think there are 33 unique characters in this game. I was already pretty substantially overwhelmed just jumping in with the launch characters and I think the 2 Fantastic Four guys who were already in.
Yeah.
When I played as probably 6 or 7 different characters to get a taste, and they were, okay, I'll say this, they were all different-ish, but I think you need to be someone who's really into this sort of game to really get the most out of that, and that's clearly just not me. And the idea of that roster ballooning to 50, 60, 70, 100, 120 characters is so off-puttingly overwhelming to me that I can't imagine revisiting this game in a year.
Mm-hmm.
Genuinely. I personally, as the type of person I am, cannot fathom how I would even approach trying to figure out what I like in a pool of that many characters. And to speak to the challenges of like finding differentiating gameplay, the sort of phrase that I'm going to use is the space between characters starts to shrink the more characters you put in there, right? So the space between the characters, by that I mean the available space upon which you can iterate and innovate on mechanics between Iron Man and the Punisher, right? Where are the gaps in what those characters can and can't do that can be replicated, tweaked, completely changed, spun, pivoted, whatever you want to call it, to create new, completely original, satisfying gameplay? The more people you start to slot in there, the smaller the spaces between those characters get. Yep. And the more challenging it will be to create anything that feels even remotely distinct from the other characters, right?
I think a good word for that is archetype, is what I would say, right? Like you can think of, to the audience, it's like the thief, the ranger, the paladin, or even just like the DPS, the healer, the tank. Like these things, when you start coming up with ideas in between them, it inherently, as you're saying, Aaron, limits, like it makes things closer and closer to being what another thing is. And it differentiates them less and less as you kind of dilute that.
Yeah. And I candidly do not... I think that if I went through and tried to find the meaningful mechanical differences between each of the 35 characters that were in the game when I started playing it, I think that I would already start to see some pretty big overlap. Which is, again, where design comes in to help be a differentiator, and that might be enough for some people, in which case, fantastic. But I do think in terms of gameplay, that is going to be a challenge for any game of this type, but certainly for one with a release cadence this aggressive, they're going to run into that sort of issue quickly.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
I mean, like, how many, granted, we're not game designers, but if I want people to just think in their mind, like, how many unique archetypes can you think of for characters that are like truly different enough to justify existing? You know what I mean? Like, in a perfect world, you just have those archetypes and they're solid and they're balanced as they can be, and they're great, right? But in a world where you constantly need to make new characters to fill those gaps, like you said, like it's going to get harder and harder because the gaps get smaller and smaller, and things are just going to start to look the same. League of Legends is a fantastic example of that, by the way, Aaron, because they have like over 100 characters. So a bunch of characters have abilities that other characters have. It gets to the point where like you're referencing other characters' abilities to explain a new character that just came out, kind of a thing. Which isn't inherently bad, but like it means they're a little less unique. Like that's one of the benefits of Overwatch that you were kind of alluding to earlier, is when you're making things at like a slower pace with more of that polish, it's gonna feel like a more unique experience to that character. And I don't know if you felt this way with Marvel Rivals, but I don't feel like the abilities for all the characters fit the characters or like add to their personality like Overwatch's characters did on launch. I don't actually know if you played Overwatch on launch. I'm assuming you played a little bit, but I feel like the abilities were an extension of the character in Overwatch. It feels a little bit less like that in Marvel. It just feels like they gave the characters abilities with some of the characters, and they weren't as well thought out as an expression of that character's personality.
Yeah, I would say maybe speaking to the lack of like narrative in this game, they are at the very least, I would say, expressions of the character's comic book powers, right? They feel contextually appropriate to me.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But I don't think I was like, oh, it feels so cool when you play as Groot to make a wall. of vines. Oh man, that's so satisfying. That's Groot for you right there. That old Groot always making walls. I didn't really get that sense. I didn't have like a delight moment at any of their ability. Like, yeah, of course the Punisher has a turret and Iron Man has missiles. It's like, yeah, it all makes sense. There's a little bit less charm to it, I think. But again, I think for the type of game that this is trying to be, contextually appropriate is probably landing pretty squarely in their intended section of the court.
I mean, clearly the game's doing okay with what they're
it's
doing.
resonating with people.
Yeah. I think the other thing, I mean, all of these are honestly loosely related because it all just relates to aggressive content cadence, is unbalanced characters and power creep. I think we've probably got a while until power creep kind of sets in, but basically power creep, for those that may not know, it's basically just the idea that newer characters are going to potentially be stronger and they're going to better fit the meta of the game, which is basically to say, when you're playing a game like League of Legends that's been out for almost 20 years, newer characters are going to have abilities that fit the context of the modern game better than characters that originally came out in the game when it was like a drastically different experience. There were less characters out, there were less abilities to think about, all of that. And so when you're releasing so many characters at a time, the context of the game changes super fast. Because you've got all these new abilities, you've got all these new characters, you have all these new considerations. And so we could get to a point where, because of the aggressive character release, it's going to make balancing more difficult, because you've got the whole thing of like, well, do we make the new character overpowered so people play them? Because one of the worst things is if they're underpowered, because then nobody wants to play them and your whole new like big shiny toy sucks. And that could kill the game if that consistently kept happening. But when they're overpowered, it ruins the whole vibe, because only 2 people can play that character on each team, or 1 person on each team can play a character. And, that can feel kind of shitty as you're constantly getting stomped by whoever the new person is. So that's another thing that I think they need to take into consideration. And I will say the game does have some balance issues. Susan Storm went from being like one of the weakest characters, Aaron, and now since you've played, because it happened with season 1, she's like one of the best characters, like in an OP kind of way.
Moon Knight is another example. His ultimate is like mathematically broken.
And then there's Jeff the fucking Shark, who is mostly fine, but his ult needs to be nerfed or telegraphed better, in my opinion. And people should be punished for jumping off the map, because that's not skill to get kills. I don't know. I kind of hate Jeff the Shark. But regardless, that's another big issue that can happen. And it's only kind of made worse when you've got such an aggressive character release schedule.
Right. Balancing in general with a very aggressive release cadence is an issue. Very briefly, we saw that with Overwatch. Obviously Helldivers 2. Obviously a very different type of game, but they were releasing content updates so regularly that they actually pissed off a huge portion of the player base, just because new weapons, new stratagems, new things. It was just all like a complete balance mess that messed up the feel of the game so much that people were ready to like completely write it off as not feeling even remotely satisfying anymore. Which they course corrected, and people are back to loving the game, but they have since moved to a much more conservative sort of release schedule for updates and new content.
Yep.
To kind of try and combat that issue.
And the other issue with like a lot of this, using the Helldiver example, is like Helldivers made that change and they lost players. And then some of the players came back, but not everybody did. So when you are too quick with your balance fixes and your, release cadence, and things get messy and whatever, like people will quit. If all the new characters are underpowered, people will get bored and they will quit. and a lot of them will never come back. If people get pub stomped by the new characters every time they come out and they're too broken, some people will quit. Like, ultimately you're going to lose players regardless. Like, it's impossible to have 100% retention, but that's kind of why taking your time with some of these things could be good. It'll be curious to see what happens to Marvel Rivals in 2 years.
Right. It's definitely going to be like, I think, not necessarily in full wrap up mode, but one of my sort of larger picture ideas, as we do approach the end of the episode, is that it's pretty obvious that the generosity of the content has been, it's weird to say a selling point for the game because it's a free game to download, but the generosity of the content has been something of a selling point, right? The fact that there is just so much content in the game at launch for free has definitely grabbed people's attention. And the idea that you will consistently be able to have new experiences, regardless of how minorly new they may be, is clearly enough to keep people interested and probably coming back. But I will be very fascinated to see how that strategy plays out in the long term. Because, again, if they pull way back and slow way down and focus on quality over quantity, they may lose some of that momentum, right? People may become bored with what's currently on offer and not want to stick around long enough to see what comes next. But if they push incredibly aggressively forward into new, always, the quality of the game may start to dip. The overall experience may suffer, and you may burn people on that level. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see how this unfolds over the next handful of years. Like you said, I personally think, again, not to say that the game is bad, I will be watching this one from the sidelines. I don't think I'm going back to Marvel Rivals. It's just not a game for me, I don't think. It would take me far too long to learn the ins and outs of why I should care to get good at it, and so I'll probably be observing this one from the sidelines as opposed to from in the trenches. But I will be watching because it is an interesting disruptor.
Yeah, no, I think they're in a decent spot because NetEase obviously has a lot of money and a lot of...
They have the resources.
Yeah, they have the resources to do a lot of this stuff. Typically, when we look at these big corporations, they tend to flop kind of eventually. I feel like it's generally when they're trying to better monetize the game. It's in a very good spot right now. I wonder if that will lead to a situation where maybe they have some big backlash. I feel like it's almost unavoidable with a lot of these huge games because someone always wants to hit the money button, and then it always, has some big negative repercussion. And also, it's such a volatile space. Like, it'll be interesting to see how long Marvel Rivals can kind of captivate a bunch of people like it is now. Yeah, I honestly don't know. I think if I had any projections, and this is kind of my final thing I'll say, when GTA 6 comes out, I think a lot of these massive multiplayer games. Ooh, I just hit my mic. I think a lot of these massive multiplayer games are going to lose a lot of players because it gives people an excuse to step away and to do something else. And obviously a lot of people will be stepping away and doing something else when GTA 6 comes out. And I think a lot of those people won't necessarily go back to the games that they were playing before. Obviously some people will, but a certain portion of the audience won't. So honestly, I think GTA could hurt not just Marvel Rivals, but a lot of these games that have players that are only really playing that game. Because GTA 6 is just going to attract so many people when it ends up dropping.
Yeah, it'll definitely. I think the longevity of that challenge for these other games will definitely depend on how robust GTA 6's multiplayer is at launch, because like Red Dead 2's multiplayer never caught on, right? It was never really fully supported, and it never caught anywhere near the audience of GTA's online experience, which I also think tonally that makes sense to some degree, because it's always a little bit more niche. But yeah, I think you're definitely there. That could be a huge disruptor for a lot of these games. They could see a pretty substantial hit for the foreseeable future, which in a game where the faucet must run constantly could end up sunsetting, some of these plans for some of these games. It's possible.
Yeah, we'll see. I don't think it'll kill anything. I just think it gives people an excuse to step away. And whenever you give someone an excuse to leave, like, some people will take it, right? So
yeah,
that's kind of the thing, is like, how many people will leave to play GTA and then not come back to the game that they were playing before?
Correct.
So yeah. Well, that was kind of my end comment. I don't think I have anything else. We've basically run through most of the stuff I had.
Yeah. No, I think I've spoken my piece. But I would be remiss not to, if you don't mind, Zach, thank Beach Girl.
Beach.
Yes, indeed. Life's a beach. Death Stranding 2. Sorry, that's a bad joke. No, as you know, if you've listened to the show, Beach Girl is the provider of our wonderful intro and outro music, but they are also, of course, the creator of some great tunes that you can find anywhere great digital music can be procured. So look up Beach Girl on Spotify, SoundCloud, Bandcamp, or any of the other streaming platforms of choice, and you will most likely find Beach Girl, and I encourage you to do so. Give it a listen. It's good times for your ears. Beach Girl.
And I am here to say you should check out eDougieArt/Mosscat Market, because she changed her name on us. So eDougieArt/Mosscat Market is the wonderful, God, I can't talk, friend of ours that helped us with our album art, our logo, all that jazz. So if you wouldn't mind too terribly much, I would recommend that you check out her work on Etsy and on Instagram. I believe on Etsy it is still eDougieArt. That's at eDougieArt. And then on Instagram, it definitely is at Mosscat Market. So make sure to check them out. We appreciate both Beach Girl and Mosscat Market for helping us get the show started. So thanks everybody for tuning in. And have a great rest of your day, your week, your life. Yeah.
Goodbye!
Communist China.